Good evening and welcome to Worldview, the international affairs show that brings you the views and news that other networks can't or won't tell you about. I'm Alan Mendoza. Our show tonight, Iran. Are we sleepwalking into nuclear disaster? We've heard a lot this past few months about the perils of nuclear proliferation. And of course, North Korea has now joined the nuclear club, with barely a whimper of meaningful international action against it. Attention has now turned to Iran, which has been conducting suspicious nuclear activity for several years, despite repeated calls to desist from the UN, US and EU. Most disturbingly, Iran continues to ignore international ultimatums, most recently failing to meet an August deadline to stop enriching uranium. Indeed, last week, in a calculated snub to the UN Security Council, meeting in New York to discuss sanctions against it, Iran announced it had speeded up this process. The Security Council has so far failed to agree a response, with the Russian threatening to veto a resolution. Intelligence sources have indicated to me that Iran will have a nuclear weapon within, and I stress within, 3 years. So, with Iran acting with increasing impunity and the UN seemingly paralysed by indecision, Worldview asks Iran, are we sleepwalking into nuclear disaster? Joining me tonight to discuss this issue, I have the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament Vice President, Bruce Kent, the author and commentator, Douglas Murray, and Alexandros Peterson, an analyst and young foreign policy professional. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. I'd like to start with you, Bruce. How serious is the problem with Iran, do you think, at the moment?
Well, I think it's quite serious. They're doing what they're entitled to do with nuclear energy, and it may be that they want a bomb, I don't know. But it seems to me the sleepwalking is on our side, since we are not observing any of the international laws that we ought to be observing. They are simply saying, probably, they want the kind of security that we want for ourselves. And I can't see anything very peculiar about that. But disaster at the end of the road, certainly.
Right, and disaster, in your view, would be an increased nuclear proliferation and...
Absolutely, but we will never deal with that until we start taking abolition negotiations seriously ourselves.
Douglas, is that the way you see things?
Well, no, patent nonsense. I mean, Mr. Kent is once again assuming benign intentions of our enemies and castigating ourselves. The problem is not with the West. The idea of disarmament on the West's part at this point, or any movement in that direction, would be absurd. That anyone is still talking about disarmament of our nuclear capability at a time that North Korea has just made a test, and Iran is a few years with reach with a bomb, is nonsensical. It's absurd. It's a suicide note.
A suicide note. Alex, sitting in the middle of these two views, are you taking a middle stance, or do you veer towards one or the other?
Well, I do veer towards one side, but I'll make a point that perhaps is not so well known. The Bush administration has, in fact, now introduced a plan to change the nuclear complex of the United States. They're going to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons that they have from the current 6,000, reduce them by 3,500, and are going to have only 2,000 in the next 10 years. So there you go. We are meeting our obligations. It's Iran, an extremely dangerous country with a regime that is bent on, has said rhetorically they want to destroy other countries. I think this is the issue, not so much us, responsible countries that are, in fact, meeting obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
But Bruce, do you think...
Not at all meeting our obligations. In my opinion, the International Court of Justice in July of 1996 said there was an obligation on the nuclear powers to start negotiations on nuclear abolition and bring them to a successful conclusion. There are no negotiations anywhere. So that is the obligation. It's not Bruce Kent suggesting it. It's the international highest tribunal in the world is saying that.
But if the US is actually engaged in reducing... Is that not a step in the right direction?
Numbers are not part of the game. Quality is what matters. We reduce numbers in this country massively, but actually we increase the capability with Trident, 6,000-mile range, high degree of accuracy. It's the quality of the nuclear weapons that actually matter, and the implication that your security depends on having some of them. And if that message goes around the world, then the North Koreas and the Irans will follow suit.
So it would be a good idea at this point in history for Britain to disarm its nuclear capability, just as North Korea has its and Iran has its. Is that going to make a difference? Is there any evidence you have that North Korea or Iran have ever followed our wishes on these things, have ever listened to our international obligations, or are likely to start doing so now?
It would be a very good idea if we sat round a table and began the process of negotiating, inviting North Korea and Iran to come along. Why not?
Well, I think we've been doing that. The six-party talks have been going on with North Korea for a decade, if not more.
They're
And
all
they've
pointed at North
the
Korea.
only thing that the six-party talks, sitting around a table with these sorts of countries, has produced is North Korea testing a nuclear weapon.
Exactly. 1993, North Korea withdrew from the treaty. Has any leverage happened in that time? Can anyone honestly say that the treatment we're now going towards Iran is anything other than indicative of what we've just seen with North Korea? That a regime like that can withdraw from all international obligations, and people like you sit around asking us to obey treaties which our enemies will never obey. And what's more, you've given benign trust that perhaps Iran isn't trying to develop a bomb.
Why is Iran in the dock? Why isn't India, Pakistan and Israel in the dock? They've all done
Why
this
would
thing
Israel
before.
be in the dock?
Why wouldn't it? It's got 200 at least nuclear warheads. It's not signed the NPT.
Well, I think the major difference is that Iran has said, Ahmadinejad has said he wants to extinguish Israel. He said he wants to wipe it off the map. In fact, he said on Al-Quds Day, October 20th, only a few days ago, that Israel has no right to exist and that it soon will not.
Or we might have Mr. Khatami's Al-Quds Day speech.
2 to 1, I suppose.
We might have
response
Mr. Khatami, the so-called moderates, a response in Al-Quds in 2003, saying that they only need one bomb, because they only need one bomb to kill every Israeli, and they'll have to have lots of bombs to get rid of all of them.
For 1 second, let's just look. Do we firstly believe that Iran is dedicated to building a nuclear weapon? I mean, Bruce, do you think that...
I don't know. How can anybody know? I don't know. I know the
suspect?
senior
Do you suspect?
Ayatollah has said that it would be against the Quran to develop a nuclear bomb. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But that's
There's not much in the Quran about the nuclear
Why
bomb.
don't we listen to each other seriously and not just insult each other?
Well, let's listen to the Iranian leadership, which has consistently over recent years said what it wants to do. But this isn't just a one-off statement. It's not just one speech of Mr. Ahmadinejad or Mr. Rafsanjani or Mr. Khatami. This is consistent speeches. We don't have to guess what they want to do. They've told us. One thing you must admit you have to do if you have an enemy, if you have somebody who is talking about wiping you out, one thing you should do is believe them.
But wiping out is not the word. It's actually dismantling the state of Israel, which at the moment is in a very difficult position with the position it's in, and I actually can't see how a two-state solution can any longer work with the settlements. But Israel is out of line with international opinion and law on nuclear weapons.
I mean, how would you answer, actually, Bruce has made a point, obviously, that why is Iran in the dock, as opposed to, say, India and Pakistan, both of whom have, of course, threatened each other at various points with military actions. I mean, what's your view on that?
Well, I mean, the escalation between Pakistan and India is very regrettable. I don't think anyone, looking back, wishes that, that India and Pakistan couldn't have got, could have been prevented from getting the bomb. As it is, we are where we are with them, and with no likelihood that we're going to be able to persuade either side to dismantle their nuclear capability, which they regard as being important for their strategic interests. But one of the things we don't see in either Pakistan or India is a desire expressed by the leadership of those countries to wipe out an entire state, unprovoked, because of an historical hatred. We don't see that from either of those states. We don't see it from any state at the moment other than Iran.
I think there's also another fundamental difference in that South Asia, Pakistan and India, is a fairly contained geopolitically in terms of the strategic realities there. Iran is not in a self-contained area, aside from the Iranian regime.
So are you saying that it's a threat to the wider world?
Well, it's a threat to the Middle East, because if the Iranians head even closer towards a nuclear bomb, forget actually getting it, but move closer to it, the Gulf states, which are very close to getting a nuclear weapon, will get one themselves, which means that Egypt will get one, which means that Israel will be on high alert, and Turkey will get one as well, and non-proliferation will spread to Europe.
Surely if one nuclear weapon goes off in India, Pakistan, for example, that's going to be a disaster.
It's absolute disaster for the whole world. One nuclear bomb goes off. You have a flashpoint over Kashmir. You have allies with China on one side. You have the United States feeding India with technology, nuclear technology. I think that nuclear proliferation is inevitable unless we start sitting down and talking about the elimination of nuclear weapons worldwide. That's my position.
Well, how would you achieve that?
Inviting people to Westminster or Tehran, for that matter, sit around and start negotiating. There's a treaty on the table. It covers inspections, it covers verification, criminalization of scientists, all those things. These things take a long time, but actually you've got to start, and it's not a question of numbers. It's a question of the end of the road, which is trying to eliminate, which means a radically different view of national sovereignty than we've had before, because we're no longer little boxes. Surely the climate change business tells us that. We're not separate from one another. We're all part of one interlocking globe.
Should we be sitting down and talking, Alex?
Well, I think we have to ask, how could we begin this sort of process? I mean, with the Iranian regime, and we're now have in fact said to the Iranians that we do want to sit and talk. We've given them incentives to sit and talk.
Should we be sitting down and talking, Alex?
Well, I think we have to ask how could we begin this sort of process. I mean, with the Iranian regime, and we're now have in fact said to the Iranians that we do want to sit and talk. We've given them incentives to sit and talk. The only thing we've asked of them is not even to stop their enrichment process, but merely to suspend it. And then we would sit down and talk. They would get trade incentives merely to sit and talk, as you say. They would, in fact, get, if their program is supposedly for peaceful reasons, they'd get provisions for nuclear power in Iran, merely for sitting down and talking with us. So if they're not willing to do it for those reasons, how are we going to sit down?
But the talking is all about them not getting it. There's no talking about us starting negotiations which might remove nuclear weapons from Britain. Or America. That's not part of the deal.
But should the two be linked? I mean, why should they be linked? Surely...
Because we have an international obligation that they should be linked from the International Court of Justice. It's a common problem, and a common solution has been proposed. But the nuclear powers are so chauvinist and so nationalistic. We saw the Indians leaping up and down with joy once they got one. That pattern is going to be followed, and I think it's a tragedy. And there'll be an accident. Nobody talks about the number of nuclear accidents. We've had all kinds of nuclear accidents, and McNamara was over here not long ago, and he said of the Cuba crisis, we were bloody lucky. That was his expression, and he was. We were.
Douglas?
Well, I like the assumption, or if one took that as being true, I like the assumption still that one would give benefit of the doubt to a regime like Tehran's, which Mr. Kent keeps on seeming to think we have no hints about its nature. He seems to assume that anything that happened in the way of disarmament from the Western nuclear powers would induce Tehran to stand down. I mean, I think this is naivety, which, I mean, if it was simply naive, then, I mean, it would be sad. But this is dangerous. I mean, this is talking about the survival of our culture, the survival of whole nations. And you're talking about it as if it's just simply being nice to somebody and saying to Iran, oh, if we do this, why wouldn't you be nice in return? I mean, this is just monstrous. This is a regime that tortures and murders its own people that have no sense of justice. Do you honestly think the ICJ is they're going to start obeying that? Mr. Ahmadinejad's regime has no sense of justice at home, has no sense of justice abroad, and you're talking about allowing us to walk straight into the trap of allowing them a nuclear bomb.
Nothing of the sort. I'm suggesting the beginning negotiations. We have hundreds of regimes, dozens of regimes with appalling records of human rights, and we aren't exactly so wonderful. Guantanamo Bay is not exactly a five-star prize, is it, for the West? But it goes on. No, but it isn't. So human rights are human rights, and we have arguments about them. But we have a President Bush who's actually now in a new policy suggesting preemptive attack on other countries. Preemptive. Not excluding nuclear weapons.
Well, I'd like to just bring this... the CND are currently running a Don't Attack Iran campaign, are they not?
Of course, don't attack anybody with nuclear weapons. It's lunacy.
Well, not with nuclear weapons. I mean, no one would attack Iran.
Don't attack Iran anyway. Attack Iran. We've just come out of Iraq. Or we haven't come out of it. My God, we're into it. And we're just realizing what a catastrophe it's been.
No, well, I mean, I just think that there's a fundamental difference here. That is that the reason why India and Israel are not proliferation problems is because these countries are democracies. Iran is a theocracy, and it's run by people who say things that are, if I'm going to use President Bush's words, unacceptable. And there is a fundamental difference.
Pakistan's a democracy.
Pakistan's not a democracy, however, it's a lot less dangerous than Iran, the leadership.
It was a democracy that used nuclear weapons in the first place, if you remember.
I'm not quite sure how relevant that is.
Well, because democracies do horrible things sometimes, don't they?
I'd like the fact that the onus is on the democracies to prove their goodness, but we have to prove the badness of autocratic, theofascist regimes. I can't understand your reasoning on this, any more than I can understand your assumption. I seem to remember the last time we spoke was during the Lebanon War, when I was speaking from the battle zone in northern Israel. And I remember then that you objected to Israel's right to self-defense in a non-nuclear way. You object now to Israel's right to nuclear defense. It's very hard for somebody not simply to come to the conclusion. You simply don't believe Israel has any right to defense, any right to exist.
That's nonsense. Absolute raving nonsense. I believe that nobody is entitled to nuclear weapons. I think they're instruments of mass destruction, and I think they violate the Geneva and Hague Conventions, full stop. Of course Israel has a right to exist. within secure borders, and so does Palestine within secure borders. And the problem is no one is prepared to sit down and start doing the division. And in fact, they've so planted settlements that the division is effectively impossible.
And again, the onus there is on Israel, not on the Hezbollah or on Lebanon or anyone else. It's the democracy that's castigated. It's the theofascists that get away with it.
I just want to present a scenario here. Look, I take on board your point about negotiations. It would be an ideal situation. Let's be frank here. We're not all the powers are not going to suddenly sit down and have negotiations.
Well,
They're just not. I mean, let's deal with realities just for one moment. I'm just going to pose a situation
That'll be
here,
stretching it for
a case study. But let's say no one is sitting down to talk. Iran continues to thumb its nose at the international community. The UN says, you know, we need to impose sanctions and so on and so forth. Do you not see that Iran is a serious threat here? And you know, if you're looking at, for example, the International Court of Justice and using that as one thing, the fact that Iran is breaking, you know, serious regulations on this from the UN, is that not a problem as well?
of course it's a problem. Any country with nuclear weapons presents a problem. Absolute problem. And it's not just the possession and whether we use them or not. It's the existence of these things. We've had them fired by... We haven't had them fired by accident. We've had bombers going off with them. We've had miscalculations that are incredible. In fact, Namara said that he didn't know that there were actually Soviet missiles on Cuba when they were doing all this strong-arm stuff with the Soviets over the blockade. And he said that's why he said we were lucky. The possibility of disaster is enormous, and we're actually gambling, I think, with our future.
Well, I think you're right that the possibility of disaster is enormous. However, it seems to me that there's more potential for disaster if a nuclear weapon is in the hands of a country like Iran, who in fact have shown through this enrichment process, some people have been to Natanz and have seen its facilities, have said that in fact they're not all that skilled and they're heading as quickly as they can towards a nuclear weapon. However, they don't really have skilled technicians, and there's real possibility of there being disaster in Iran. So why should they have one?
And on this matter as well, I mean, this is an important thing. Let's just take, well, not in the way Mr. Ahmadinejad means, but let's just take Israel out of the equation for a moment. The best case scenario we see in the Middle East, if Iran continues to get away with this, if it continues to flap, the best case scenario is a nuclear rush across the Middle East. We know there are already deals being done in the background. We know that Mr. Khan's network will get straight in and work with Saudi and all the other countries. So the best thing that will happen if you don't stand up to Iran now is that you have a Middle East that goes nuclear to core within 10 years.
So what needs
that
to happen?
is the price.
What needs to happen right now? Given
point.
Russia's causing problems at the Security Council, what needs to happen right now?
What needs to happen is that the deadline, the serious deadline, needs to be given to Iran within a very short space of time. And the most important thing that has to happen is that the Western powers, primarily Britain and America, make it clear to Tehran that force is on the table. I've never heard anything so absurd as former Secretary Jack Straw's claim that there was no, that the military option was off the table. I've never heard of a negotiation between nation states in which force is seriously off the table. These discussions aren't academic things. They're not tea mornings. They're occasions when states sit down and leverage power between each other. And if you take force off the table, if you say to Iran, we're really serious about this, but we will never even consider the use of force, that isn't a negotiation.
Well, that was perhaps, I mean, the UK and the US playing good cop, bad cop. But also, I mean, you say setting another deadline. We've set several deadlines. The Iranians have just stepped over them and then, you know, sort of given us the middle finger. So what is...
I'm saying a serious deadline, at which point you say that we take out the facilities by this date.
I'm in a kind of lunatic asylum. If we're actually talking about... If the implication is we want to go to war with Iran, having just finished with Iraq, we're going to go war with Iran. Iran has missiles. You can strike anybody in the Middle East. It's quite substantial armed forces. You can let's sit there and be attacked. We're going to actually open up a pot that we won't be able to close the lid of if we start that.
Okay, I'm going to have to move on, but that's the final word there. But I think we have a bit of a disagreement here on that issue.
A little bit, yeah.
We are indeed, We're going to move to the section of the show where I ask the guests to bring something to the table. And Bruce, what have you got? What article do you feel deserves more prominence or
Well, I mean, we're all
today?
actually up to our eyeballs, aren't we, with stuff about nuclear, global warming and all this. It's all over the place, everywhere. I've got an article in The Guardian here, everywhere. I'd just like to point out that the one issue that is never raised in any of this plethora of articles is the question of the military contribution to global warming. The military of the world use something like a quarter of the high-octane fuel for aircraft. They use immense amounts of oil. The Pentagon just to only because I know the figures of the Pentagon, I don't know the others. Pentagon uses more than any other government body anywhere. We use metals, we emit all kinds of stuff in construction. So, but the military factor seems somehow to be left out. Rather like last year in Edinburgh, they left out, they said make poverty history, but they never talked about the $1 trillion a year we spend on war.
So the military being polluters, Douglas?
No,
you're looking sceptical.
It's impossible to know even where to begin on this. No, the green issue, this is a great opportunity for anti-war lobbies to collide their two pet things, which is global warming and the military, and to claim now that the military might be responsible for global warming. I mean, I can't see it's even a serious story.
Alex?
Well, I think it's a fair point. If you are concerned about environmental damage, if you're concerned about oil spills and things like that, I mean, yes, the militaries of the world pollute. However, I mean, it would be stupid to deny that. However, the militaries of the world, I would say, particularly those of the West, are essential pieces for defending those states, for defending our way of life. If it wasn't for our militaries, we wouldn't be here now. And so, you know, it's quite important, I think, that we maintain our military capabilities exactly for this.
That's not a problem. But I think we have to start thinking about other forms of security. You and I are not armed, but we're sitting here in a perfectly pleasant sort of way. Maybe we can be a bit rude to each other. We want to be. We're not going to kill each other. Why don't we think about security in other ways than being armed to the teeth against somebody else? And that is the normal condition of human life. But it's not one we practice
It's so
internationally.
abnormal that it's never happened.
It happens all the time.
Alex,
Happens all the time.
what do you have for us?
What I'm bringing to the table is something that is ignored. I say it's ignored because I'm interested in Russia, but President Vladimir Putin of Russia has tried to strong-arm in the past few days Ukraine, saying that they need to extend the lease of the Russian Black Sea Fleet base in Ukraine past 2017, which is already very long. And now, this may not seem all that interesting or important to a lot of people. However, it is, because as the EU and NATO expands into that area, we could find that by 2017, when the Russians may have the Black Sea Fleet, the biggest naval fleet within the EU, within EU waters, if Ukraine is to become part of the EU before that, or around that time. So I think that's significant.
Douglas?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. I hadn't followed it. So.
Do you think it follows the general pattern that we're seeing with Putin at the moment?
Well, I suppose so. I mean, Putin, in my mind, is a rather hard leader to read, and I think it's rather hard to tell what his ambitions at this point are. He gives off rather different signs. I mean, obviously, he wants his nation to remain looking like a global power of some kind. It doesn't look that way to me from the outside at the moment. And much as you know, the Russian military force is decaying beyond repair, as it were, and is looking rather like an old battleship that's not really worthy to go to sea.
It's environmental pollution, in fact.
I don't think that's causing it.
Well, it does. I mean, the Russian Black Sea Fleet is one of the is a huge contributor to environmental pollution. If that's
well, how about letting Russia into the EU and inviting them to join NATO? I mean, if Turkey's coming in, why shouldn't Russia? Let's talk about why do we have to have a permanent back of our minds that there's an evil empire to be dealt with in the new situation of today, whatever of the past?
Why not? There has to be reforms in Russia. I mean, you would consider admitting them in the current way?
Reforms in Poland, reforms everywhere, including here. But
well, I don't think they're very interested in being admitted. I think that's the...
Well, let's try. Let's see. And why not?
Well, I think we have, in fact. We tried that in the 90s. And
well, we pushed the NATO right up to the borders, didn't we? Which is a fairly hostile thing to have done to you.
Well, there's a NATO-Russia partnership, and the idea is to have eventually Russia part of NATO. It's them that they don't want it.
Who knows where NATO's going to go next? I mean, no one ever thought of Afghanistan as a place for NATO when NATO started.
Israeli entry.
So maybe. Let's have a global NATO. Why not? While we're at it.
Could be interesting if it works. Douglas, your story, please.
Oh, it's a very different story. I thought that one of the stories of the week, which will not get much coverage elsewhere, but is being covered a little bit in the Dutch media at any rate, is a very small-scale thing, I suppose, for people outside of Holland, but I think a very large problem for democracy, which is that Geert Wilders, who runs a very small party in Holland, which has been ostracized in recent years. Geert Wilders himself, much like Alan Hessiali, has to spend his life under armed guard, in security, has to live on army bases, has an exceedingly unpleasant existence. In the campaigning for next month's elections, Two of his supporters in the north of Holland were putting up posters and were severely beaten by local Muslim Morocco lads. This might not seem like a big thing, but I think it is. I think it's very worrying that the process of democracy cannot safely go on in a European country without people fearing for their lives for supporting a political party which is not extremist, which is simply supporting a man who is much hated by large proportions of that country.
Is this a problem for European democracy? Is it
Well,
tell for things to come?
Well, it may be a problem for democracy. I mean, I think to some extent it's a clash of cultures. I mean, you see this in lots of countries where you have a significant Muslim populations, and it seems to be coming to a head. I mean, you have the veil issue here. In Denmark, you have more conservative parties being voted in because, as a reaction to this clash of cultures. You have, for example, lately in Denmark, the issue of public swimming pools, where Muslim women are essentially not taking showers before going into the swimming pools and going in there fully clothed. And this is extremely shocking to Danish society, obviously, that go in there almost not clothed. Yeah. And so I think that there's all these frictions. And
school children in Denmark who swim in different pools, so the girls and boys in different pools because Muslim girls can't swim with infidel boys.
Clash of civilization?
Well, I think our job is to build bridges in everywhere we can. These are bizarre things, of course, but I know all sorts of Muslims who actually wouldn't agree with the sort of thing they were talking about. Well, after all, in Northern Ireland, we had Catholics and Protestants beating up each other for voting in the wrong place or voting for the wrong candidate. It's not an Islamic affair, unfortunately. It's a tendency which I think is to be deplored anywhere it starts. And it is a threat to democracy. People should be able to vote freely for a candidate they want to. Absolutely. I agree with you, Douglas. There we are.
Marvellous. Painful, but it's true. I think, Douglas, you're actually speaking about this, aren't you, next Monday? And,
that's right.
The New Culture Forum. Right, a quick scoot through our regular global risk analysis. And this week, 3 countries have an increased risk factor. Pakistan, Mexico and Fiji. In Pakistan, thousands of pro-Taliban demonstrators have been marching in cities in the northwest following government airstrike against a madrasa operating at the front against militants. The demonstrators have called for an end to Pakistan's alliance with the US in the war on terror and for a jihad on America. In Mexico, President Fox has had to call in riot police to disperse teachers and left-wing protesters who are taking control of the city centre of Oaxaca. The protesters have been engaged in a 5-month campaign to get rid of the governor there, who they accuse of corruption and indeed authoritarianism. In Fiji, the government has failed in an attempt to remove the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The Commodore Balamanarana, who has actually been critical of government policies, had actually threatened to invoke the resignation of the Prime Minister based on amnesties for the coup of 2000. Government tried to replace him, but the replacement actually said he backed the military chief, so expect problems there. In good news, however, the Democratic Republic of Congo saw a very orderly presidential runoff on Sunday. There had been fears that the 2 candidates would engage in violence if there were irregularities in the polls. And lastly, having joined the nuclear club, North Korea has actually agreed to return to 6-party talks, and these will be commencing shortly. And the 6 countries involved are the 2 Koreas, the US, Russia, Japan and China. They last met in November 2005. Bruce, what stands out for you amongst those stories?
Well, I suppose the Taliban in Pakistan does, because that's a critical country, it's a nuclear-armed country, and I think a regime like that in Pakistan would be a disaster. But, so that's, to me, the most internationally worrying about the stories you've just related.
Alex, do you agree?
I would agree, actually. Well, obviously, North Korea is extremely worrying, but I think it's a bit silly that we're clapping each other on the back just because they came back to the talks that they've been doing for the past 10 years, and now they've already gotten a nuclear bomb. But Pakistan is important, I think, because you have this regime that is essentially refusing to take care of its own backyard and refuses to let the United States do it for them. And so there's real problems, I think, in that part of Pakistan.
Douglas, it is a problem, isn't it, the Pakistan
yes,
situation?
Of course. I mean, it's been a problem we've all known about for the last 5 years. I remember, I think that on the day after 9/11, Dick Armitage was seeing the Pakistanis, and he said to them, no, history starts today. So when they said, no, we've got a long problem going back many years with Taliban and so on, said, no, history starts today. Sadly, history only seemed to have begun that day.
Pakistan have just signed an agreement, did they not, with several of the frontier tribes peoples, which seems to
make some difference, but I mean the problem always is with whether or not knowing whether or not the ISI, for instance, the Pakistani security service, is really on our side. And I mean, every time you can trace, it's very interesting, trace the number when an top Al Qaeda guy is given up by the ISI. It is always at a crucial moment when the West is like something. They know exactly when to put somebody in our direction.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate it. And thank you for watching. And join me again for another Worldview next week and send in your comments. Thank you.